Okay? Now, what's the purpose of these primaries and caucuses? I'll sort out the difference between a primary and caucus with you here in just a second. But let's first talk about what is the purpose of these primaries and caucuses. Well, technically, the purpose of this stage, and this is specific to presidential elections. Okay? I want to make sure everybody's clear about this point. These points that we're talking about right here apply specifically to presidential elections. The difference is, as you'll see here in a moment, when we're talking about all those other offices, like U.S. Senator and U.S. House of Representatives and Texas Governor and Lieutenant Governor and all those county offices and so on, those are what we call a direct primary. That's what we call a direct primary. This nomination process is what we call a direct primary. So make a note. Okay, put a little asterisk by that or underline it or something. And hang on to that, because as we talk about this process as it pertains to presidential elections, you'll want to be able to make that distinction. Okay? So, the nomination process that the Democratic Party uses, the nomination process that the Republican Party uses for their presidential candidates doesn't involve the use of a direct primary. It involves the use of what we call preference primaries, presidential preference primaries. Okay? The purpose, whether we're talking about primaries or caucuses, presidential preference primaries or caucuses, is to select delegates to attend the party's national nominating convention. Okay? And it is the function of the National Nominating Convention to officially nominate the presidential candidate, the party's presidential and vice presidential candidate. The process varies substantially from state to state, depending on whether the state uses primaries, caucuses, or a combination of the two, and on rules of each political party. So it's very difficult to generalize about this process because of these variations. The way that the process works in the Democratic Party is not the same as the way that it works in the Republican Party. And the way that it will work in 2016 is not going to be identical to the way that it worked in 2012, which was not identical to the way that it worked in 2008 and 2004 and so on as we go back in time. Okay? And it also varies from state to state. The way that the process works in Texas is not the same as the way that it works in Louisiana or Idaho or Michigan or any other state. It's just a jumble, okay? Nevertheless, we're going to try to sort out some things, at least as they pertain to Texas. So the two major parties, the Democratic and Republican parties, use some combination of primaries and caucuses. Minor parties, the Greens Party, the Libertarian Party, they have some other ways that they can operate under state election laws. It's usually based on how many votes their candidates got in the most recent election. Okay, so there's just some initial points that we were laying out here. So what's the purpose of these primaries and caucuses when we're talking about presidential politics? Select delegates to attend a national nominating convention, the purpose of which is to officially nominate the party's candidate for president. Okay, good. Now, let's talk a little bit about the difference between primaries and caucuses. Let me back out of this for a second.